Welcome to Galaxy Dungeon. In this video, I'm going to analyze the dungeon design of the 1988 JRPG Dragon Quest III: The Seeds of Salvation. If you don't already know, Dragon Quest III, also known as Dragon Warrior 3, is a sequel to Dragon Quest II made by Enix. You start off in a small, unnamed landmass, and there's a cave called Promontory to the south, and one area called the Cave of Enticement in the east, and a second town called Reeve in the northwest. This area will give the player some time to grind, or they can fight monsters to grind in the cave to the south. The landmass links 3 dungeons, where you have to play through 2 of them, while 1 is optional. The first one is optional as it leads to the Najima Tower, which can be entered through an alternative entrance anyway. It's called the Cave of Promontory. It's pretty simple, but is a good spot to grind and has a few different choices for the player to make and leads to a bigger dungeon. Najima Tower, also known as the Dreamer's Tower, is a 5-floored tower dungeon. You enter it looking for a man with a thieves' key that you need to progress. You can't enter the island on your own because you have no access to a boat or any way of getting across the ocean at this point, so you have to use the underground passageway in the last dungeon to reach it. The dungeon has open boundaries to fall off like most tower dungeons, and it has 3 different entrances and many dead ends, but the treasure is scattered in a similar manner as the previous game, Dragon Quest II. There are 2 locked doors, and at the end, you get the key from an NPC, and there's one connecting the 2 entrances to highest floors that only exist for you to test the key out. But while you're leaving, you can use it to get one last piece of treasure. The monsters are the same as the monsters on the overworld in this area. Then there's the Cave of Enticement, a pathway dungeon leading to a teleporter. It's only a little bit harder than the last one and requires an explosive just to access. Then there's one dead end, lower level, that every trapdoor in the dungeon leads to, and it can only be escaped through a staircase that leads back to the beginning, right after you blew up the wall. The entire area is pretty tricky to navigate and has treasure to encourage the player to look around. Lastly, there are 3 separate doors you need to choose which one to go down, as 2 of them are dead ends. One leads to a teleporter to the Shrine of Promise, which allows the user to progress to another continent. The next dungeon is the Champagne Tower, a small dungeon with 6 floors where the monsters are harder, but they're the same kind of monsters that you'll find outside, with one new addition you haven't seen yet. Plus, there's a new monster that functions as a boss, with several guards that are very difficult to beat at this point. It's a lot like the last few dungeons, with places to fall off, and many floors with mediocre monsters. It's also the location of this game's first boss battle. The next dungeon is the Cave of Dreams, also known as the Underground Lake. It's a cave where a pair of star-crossed lovers hid a jewel called the Dream Ruby. You go to it and find it so you can give it back to its owner to get them to lift a sleeping curse on a village. It's pretty simple, but it's a naturally made cave dungeon, but it has some pretty cool monsters that are pretty rare, and there's only 4 different kinds. However, so many of them attack at once, and they attack so fast that they can easily overpower the player. The next dungeon is the Pyramid, and it looks amazing. The Pyramid is a huge dungeon with 8 floors, traps, puzzles, and cool monsters. It finds a nice balance between linearity and non-linearity, and has traps, puzzles, and secrets. The dungeon is so interesting, I already posted a video about it. The next dungeon is the Kidnapper's Cave. It's a pretty large, but simple dungeon, short of a few puzzles. It only has 2 floors. In the first one, you can only see 1 room at a time, and there's 8 rooms that are pretty much the same. On the sides, the rooms lead into dead ends, except for 6, where the walls turn out to be doors, but you can only figure it out by analyzing the sound effect. which this is a little confusing to figure out when there are random encounters with powerful monsters, some of which will slowly drain the player's magic points, which will make it harder to escape. The treasure is scattered pretty well, and there are a few booby-trapped treasure chests. The second floor is small, and you'll have to enter it, save hostages, and fight the dungeon boss and all of his goons. The next one is the Tower of Garuna. It's a tower that has many different directions to go, puzzles, and teleporters. For instance, to get a book called the Book of Satori that you can use to upgrade one of your characters to the Sage class, you have to leap from a certain section in one of the higher floors to get to it, and it has several different directions to go, and staircases to climb from, and a puzzle where you have to jump from a tightrope to land on a certain section of the dungeons that you couldn't before. A bunch of these pathways get nowhere, but some will let you see more of the dungeon and talk to NPCs. One path lets you go through many higher floors, where most of them have treasure. Also, you have to figure out the structure of the dungeon and jump from the highest tightrope to get to this section. And there are 2 teleporters, but they only lead to one section that leads to more confusing pathways and an NPC. The next dungeon is Orochi's Lair. It's the first dungeon that involves one of the 6 orbs, the MacGuffins of the game, that you need to hatch a phoenix. It's a cave where a 5-headed dragon is sacrificing people to it. It's actually a pretty small and simple dungeon, although the monsters are very difficult, and some of them are fire, rock, and metal themed, which fits the dungeon's theme because it's a volcano dungeon. However, unlike the volcano dungeons I've checked out, there aren't any lava traps. All the paths are dead ends, and the only treasure is a cursed demon mask that will give whoever wears it extreme defense, but will leave them so confused they'll end up fighting each other. There's a second floor with 4 dead ends and a boss battle, which will send you back to the shrine, where you'll have to fight it again to get the purple orb. The next one, the Tower of Arp, is a tower of 5 floors, like a lot of the tower dungeons in this series, and features parts you can fall off of and land on lower floors, but now the highest floor is full of tight ropes, and there's one puzzle where you have to leap off a certain section to land on a room in the center with 4 treasure chests, including the echo flute that you really need. The monsters are different from the ones fought up to this point, and difficult, but not too difficult to beat. It's complex, but not the most complex dungeon in this game. The next dungeon is the Navel of Earth. It's a dungeon that looks pretty simple, but unlike the others, you can only enter it with one character. The first corridor is a trap that will send you running around in circles. The second corridor has a treasure chest and one that's trapped. Then there's one big floor with 4 staircases to the higher floor, but one to a lower floor. The floor leading to the orb has a voice telling the player to go back, but it only helps on one path that leads to a dead end, while the other leads to the blue orb. The next dungeon is the Samanio Cave, a cave dungeon that you enter just to get the Mirror of Ra to save a nearby kingdom called Samanio. In the remakes, it's called Manoza instead. This dungeon is a cave dungeon, but it's very complicated. First of all, there are multiple ways to turn in the first floor, which is actually empty. The second floor splits up some more with a lot of treasure and traps. There's 2 ways to reach the second floor, but only through one trap can you reach the mirror you came for. Then there's a final floor with a lot of unnecessary treasure and a plush suit. This one's structure resembles the dungeons of the first Final Fantasy game more than most of the dungeons of this game. Several of its sections, the beginning and the end, function like a maze, while the middle is simple, but has well-distributed treasure accessible by more than one path. As a labyrinth and cave dungeon, it's pretty good for the time. The next dungeon is the Phantom Ship. First of all, in JRPGs, ghost ships becoming dungeons are common. The dungeon is pretty small, but still technically a dungeon. It has a bunch of NPCs and set encounters. The rooms are very simple, but there's some treasure. The next dungeon is the Cave of Necrogond, a really big cave dungeon with some extremely difficult monsters. It has some traps that send the player around in circles and back to where they started. The first floor has treasure in multiple different directions, but the others don't. This dungeon tries to confuse the player and does a pretty good job at it. The dungeon's first floor is all about searching for treasure and staircases in a maze. The second and third floor are about confusing the player by sending them around in circles, and the final floor is about overcomplicating a rather simple final floor, making the player fight too many monsters and run out of health. Also, the monsters are so difficult that as soon as you get through, a holy man is so impressed he'll give you a silver orb just for making it through. The next dungeon is the Castle of Baramos, the villain who's been the main antagonist up to this point. It's on the inside and outside of a castle with a few floors. There are many different paths to take, but only a few will take you further. Also, the monsters are very difficult, and the final boss is very difficult. There's only 3 pieces of treasure in the entire dungeon, and they're all in one spot. 2 of them are cursed. When you jump into the lower world, you'll find more dungeons, some of which are recreations of ones in the first game. The first is the North Cave, which is nearly identical, except you don't need to use a lamp to see. And there's another room at the bottom. Then there's the West Cave, which is southwest of one of the first towns. It's based on the Craggy Cave from the first game, and like the first game, it's optional. But it's bigger, and you don't need to light spells to explore it this time. The next one is a tower dungeon called the Tower of Rubus. It's full of puzzles and the spatial reasoning isn't that bad. Also, it looks pretty good compared to some of the game's other dungeons. It has laser grids that you'll have to use a step guard spell to protect your party when walking over them. It has places where you can fall off the tower, but they're not everywhere. It has mimics and tiles that will send the player in the wrong directions, so you'll have to figure out different turns needed to move when you're on them. The treasure's distributed pretty well, and it's a maze where the player has an incentive to explore each and every floor. It ends with a statue that you have to use a flute from a nearby town to awaken the spirit of the creator of Alefgard, Rubus. She gives you a sacred amulet. The final dungeon is the Castle of Zoma, which is kind of like the complex dungeon at the end of the first game, which it's in the same location, but it's a lot bigger and looks cooler due to the improved graphics. It has some traps, but nothing too major. Also, there's 2 doors that lock the player in one room where they'll have to fight a boss to escape. In the first floor, there are several paths to take, but all but one lead to dead ends. Near the end, there's a boss gauntlet where you have to fight 3 bosses in a row, and then fight the main villain Zoma, who is nearly impossible unless you have a certain light orb, which is in the upper world. Looking back at all these dungeons, this game does a pretty good job with the variety of dungeons. It has good tower dungeons, castle dungeons, puzzle dungeons, and all kinds of stuff. Also, the traps and puzzles are pretty cool. For this time, the graphics of these dungeons look pretty good, especially the pyramid. For one of the most popular JRPGs of the era, and one that inspired many other JRPGs for years to come, including the Dragon Quest series, these dungeons are pretty well rounded. Thanks for watching. Have a wonderful day.